In the darkest days of World War II, as Nazi forces advanced across Eastern Europe, a fierce and unwavering resistance rose from the shadows, the Soviet partisans. Among them were women, often young and unarmed, who defied the oppressive regime by sabotaging German supply lines, gathering intelligence and engaging in direct combat. These women were not merely soldiers, but symbols of resilience, courage, and unbreakable resolve. Yet their contributions to the war effort came at a staggering cost. Captured by the Nazis, many faced unimaginable torture and brutal executions, their bodies silenced but their spirits unbroken. Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya, Liza Chaikina, Anna Morozova. These names echo through history, remembered for their sacrifices and the brutality they endured. But why, despite their heroic acts, were these women subjected to such cruelty? How did their strength in life and death become a symbol of resistance, even in the face of ruthless annihilation? The rise of women partisans in Nazi-occupied territories. Acts of courage, defiance, and resistance. It was in the initial phases of the regime in Nazi-occupied territories across the Soviet Union, as the German military sped into the European interior, that the idea and the practice of the resistance started. Amongst those who stood to fight the invaders were Soviet women, citizens, mothers and daughters who took active and dangerous roles to be part of the partisans. These were the women who volunteered to join the partisan units or were recruited because, driven by the spirit of patriotism and the pain of having their homes and families ravaged by Nazi cruelty, they decided to stand up and resist. Partisans emerged in the forests of the occupied territories of the Soviet Union no later than 1941, after the barbarous invasion of Germany into the Soviet Union. These groups, initially with military personnel, civilians and sometimes even deserters from the German ranks, gradually filled up as the call for resistance increased. For Soviet women who earlier on would not be allowed to serve in the military regularly, this was the perfect chance to serve on the warfront. They enlisted not only to retaliate for friends and family who were killed, but also to save their country, their traditions, and even their race. Women partisans were not only passive players in the background, they were fighters who met enemies on the battlefield, performed sabotage operations, and played crucial roles as spying agents. Their responsibilities in the organization were diverse, depending on the tasks they carried out. In the woodland, guerrilla fighting formed the core of the resistance, and women participated in plotting and carrying out attacks on German transport, depressing railway tracks, and vandalizing other structures. They knew the ground and had the local population on their side, who helped them escape the Nazis during these hazardous actions. Some women made their contributions and became legends like Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya. Zoya was an 18-year-old girl who was captured by the Nazis when she attempted to destroy the bridge during a sabotage mission. She was tortured, but never given the names of her squad members. Her public execution in 1941 symbolized further resistance for several more people to carry on fighting incessantly. Some others, such as Maria Polivanova and Natalia Kovshova, were in the sniper teams whereby they shot and eliminated the high-rank Nazi officials and soldiers to create chaos among the enemy lines. Spying was another essential activity that women from Soviet societies performed in the partisan movement. They went into German supply lines and disguised themselves as ordinary workers, but they got important information on the movement of the Nazis. Moreover, women secretly transported important information from one partisan unit to another, together with the Soviet command. They could sneak through the enemy's territories and gather information that would be useful to devise counter-strategies against enemy movements. However, women also had a lot to do with the organization of the resistance. They became the commanders of partisan groups responsible for recruiting new members and teaching them about sabotage and guerrilla warfare. Participants like Yelena Kolesova contributed to the solidarity of certain factions of the resistance movement, synchronizing actions in terms of supply and distribution of weapons. These generated stunning organizational skills that made it possible for the workings of the resistance, no matter how things seemed hopeless. Soviet women partisans also demonstrated high levels of endurance despite the potential threat of betrayal, leading to capture at any time. They had to encounter not only the horrors of the battle, but also have always been in fear of the Germans getting revenge on them. Torture and planned executions of victims, as well as organized mass punishments, were carried out as the Nazis attempted to defeat the spirits of the Soviet partisans. Still, those horrors could not obscure the consistent struggle of these women, who wrestled vigorously to fight for what they deserved. The Razored Souls, stories and briefs of the victimized and resilient Soviet women partisans. The Soviet Union's defense against the invasion of the Nazis during the Second World War was mainly remembered as a heroic stand that came at a hefty price. Among the countless heroic partisans who struggled for the native land, Soviet women actively participated in the battles and worked as intel informers, spies, and organizers. However, for most of those women, the courage would be their undoing, since they all met their untimely deaths at the hands of the Nazi regime. These are the stories of women who had exceptional courage. Although the war demolished every hope, these women remained steadfast in the line of fire. In fact, Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya, possibly the most famous of the Soviet women partisans, fought evil despite the horrible things done to her. Only at the age of 18, she became a partisan to actively resist the Nazi occupation that had deleteriously affected her country. Zoya's most profound act of defiance was an assignment given to her in late 1941 to cut the German communication line. But after accomplishing her goal, she was arrested by the Nazis. Even after getting aggressively tortured, she did not budge, did not spill names, and proved strong and upright with a sense of responsibility. They tortured her severely, but she did not tell them any name and remained steadfast and loyal with a sense of responsibility. Her death penalty, by public hanging on November 29, 1941, was thought to deter the resistance, but instead became a conduit for a relentless spirit, and hence was remembered as a symbol of resistance. In the specific forests of Belarus, Maria Polivanova and Natalia Kovshova became great partners in forming the sniper team. They were trained to track the Nazis from long ranges and were very effective. They performed several missions and caused severe damage to the opponent's forces. But the luck would run out at some point in their lives. Both were captured by German soldiers after a very stiff battle. The two women were publicly executed by the Nazis in 1942, which were aimed by the German occupants to quench the spirit of the partisans in Belarus. These daring actions and their losses underscore the harsh conditions in which women stood up to defiance against a genocidal and oppressive regime. Yelena Kolesova, another women's rights activist and another partisan, was also a leader and an organizer in the underground movement. Skilled in the organization, Kolesova rallied different units of fighters into a solid group. Her role in the sabotage activities and as an intelligence officer rendered her an essential member of the Soviet regime, but her work put her in the danger of Nazi reprisal. In the year 1942, Kolesova was captured by the Nazis. She was betrayed by a partisan. She was then subjected to a lot of torture and then killed ruthlessly. Her death was unfortunate, and perhaps she ensured that she would be remembered for her dedication to the partisan movement. Another young woman who fought the Nazis was Liza Chaikina. Liza was remembered as an energetic woman who demonstrated great determination and bravery. She was involved in planning attacks on Nazi convoys as well as coordinating the connections between the various resistance groups. However, her actions provoked the forces and she was soon traced and arrested. The Nazis were frustrated in their attempts to bend her to their will and subjected her to unspeakable torture. She was finally killed by the occupied Nazi forces in the spring of 1942. Her death was another blow to the partisan movement, but her bravery made the rest of them bold. Anna Morozova was a fearless intelligence agent, and among only a handful of brave spies who operated in the forests of occupied Ukraine. She penetrated behind the German lines to get information crucial for Soviet counterstrikes. Morozova fared well in her endeavors to help the Soviets, but it did not remain well with her since she got trapped in the hands of the Nazis. As with the others, she was tormented with terrible questioning methods, but she never changed her mind. Finally, she was killed, and her body was left as a deterrent to other freedom fighters. Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya, a symbol of defiance, courage, and resistance against tyranny and oppression. In the freezing winter of 1941, and with the Germans rapidly advancing through the Soviet Union, an 18-year-old girl became the symbol of Soviet resistance. Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya was a partisan girl from Osinogai village who became memorable in the Soviet people's fight against Nazism. Her pride, courage, and intention to dedicate herself to a national cause brought her from an unknown girl to a martyr whose name would resound in the ears of generations. Zoya was born in the year 1923, but she began her actual age of communism when Germany attacked the Soviet Union in June 1941. She was initially a student in Moscow, but when the Nazi forces started to invade her native land, Zoya could not stay reluctant. She had always desired to fight for her country. Despite being young, she decided to join a partisan group. She gained a reputation for being a courageous woman, and especially for volunteering for what was more or less suicide duty, including the execution of sabotage raids beyond the front lines. Zoya's loyalty was put to the extreme in November of 1941. She was assigned a vital demolition assignment in the village of Petrishchevo. She was to eliminate a German communication line. There was never any ambiguity in the mission, yet Zoya did not blink an eye before agreeing to do it. During the night, she and her fellow soldiers burnt the German-occupied village stables in the belief that they would be able to repay the enemy. But the operation failed, and Zoya was captured by the Germans into captivity. When the Nazis captured Zoya, they tortured her unbearably in a bid to interrogate her and get some information from her. They wished to know the names of her comrades, the place of existence of the other partisan groups, and when the following acts of resistance would be carried out. Yet Zoya remained resolute. Even in the worst circumstances of physical violence and threats, she did not disclose any information and remained loyal to her comrades and the Soviet Union. Her decision to stay mute became rebellious enough to encourage many other people to become partisan members. The beautiful Zoya was executed on November 29, 1941. The Nazis had a plan and wished to demoralize the Soviet people. They had to set an example for her. In particular, she was executed by hanging in public in the center of the village of Petrishchevo. The Germans wanted her to be killed to serve as a deterrent to other partisans because they tried to portray themselves as the robust regime they were. Her execution was cruel, but till the last moments she showed great courage. Yelena Kolesova, the underground organizer who defied tyranny with courage, strategy, and unwavering resolve. Yelena Kolesova, born in 1917 in the town known as Sverdlovsk, was hardly a soldier or a warrior when she first got into the fight. She was a teacher in a school, another woman who, just like millions of women, had never dreamt of being a leader. But when the call came, she answered it. The occupying forces of the Nazis, as they invaded the Soviet territory in the year 1941, forced the Soviet leadership to consider that instead of having armed fighters to defend against the Germans, it also needed organizers. Yelena, realizing the need of the hour, got involved in the planning of establishing partisan groups with the mission to function behind the enemy lines. Kolesova was not a fighter, but an intelligent woman who had her position and knew the essence of guerrilla warfare. She linked different partisan groups and coordinated and ensured the passing of important information to the Soviet military. Her talent for attracting numerous groups of liberated persons and turning them into a strong, united force was essential in the first years of the war, when coordinating guerrilla activities for sabotage and intelligence gathering was crucial. Her own spy ring performed many acts of sabotage on German supply routes, struck at crucial facilities, and gathered critical information regarding the enemy's movements. However, risks were always present due to the propensity of the tasks accomplished in such an environment. As the certainty of identification increased, Kolesova did not waver in her support for the partisan movement, and as a result, became one of the most prominent leaders of the Soviet partisans. But results and accomplishments ensured her fate to receive targeted persecution at the hands of the Nazis. Yelena was captured by the German troops in 1942. After a series of successful operations, she also met a traitor among the partisans. Like most other partisan fighters who fell into the hands of the Nazis, she was brutally tortured in a bid to get her to reveal information about different forms of resistance and fighters. She declined to give out the names of her fellow rebels to preserve the safety of the spy ring she had constructed over the years. Having spent several days in pain, Yelena Kolesova was condemned to death by the Nazis. She would not speak during her journey to the gallows, the same demeanor that she had turned in the entire revolt experience. The cold winter of 1942 saw her in a hollow dig, where she was shot dead by a firing squad together with other partisans who were also caught. Liza Chaikina, the fearless partisan leader who fought bravely against Nazi oppression and tyranny. Liza Chaikina became a courageous and tough partisan leader whose name became a legend in the Soviet resistance movement during World War II. Liza was born in 1915 in the village of Yelizorovo in the Kalinin Oblast. She was a very young woman when Germany attacked the Soviet Union in 1941. Like many others, she lost her freedom to the savagery of the war, but she decided to oppose it with courage. When the Nazis came to the Soviet Union, Liza Chaikina decided to become a partisan and fight the enemy that devastated her country. She became an active participant in the resistance movement in Kalinin, which is modern Tver today, as a leader of a group of partisans engaged in sabotage acts, reconnaissance, and attacks on the infrastructure of the German occupying forces. As its leader, Liza played a critical role in planning sabotage strategies, which were executed to cut off German sources of fuel, affected their communication systems, and generally reduced their capacity to support themselves. She was characterized as a very determined, often referred to as a resourceful woman who would never back down until or unless she wins or gets overwhelmed. Her unit conducted many acts of guerrilla warfare, blowing up railroad tracks, wrecking trains, and attacking German military scouts. Her gambles on the battlefronts and her part in the command of partisan detachments made her a focal point of the Nazi leadership's violence. Liza was captured by the Gestapo while she was conducting an operation. Regarding her capture, the specific circumstances did not become evident, though the Nazis, who sought to get rid of the foremost figure in the resistance, decided to escalate the pressure. In their bid to force her to reveal information, they kept her in a torture cell, raped, and subjected her to other forms of physical and mental torture. However, Liza refused to surrender. When she did not respond and did not inform of herself and her cause, the Nazis decided to eliminate Liza Chaikina. The young partisan leader was 26 years old when, in December of 1941, she was shot by a firing squad. Anna Morozova, the silent yet daring spy who changed the course of history. Anna Morozova is an example of a Belarusian woman who would become an emblem of valor in World War II regarding the Nazi invasion. Anna, born in the early 1920s in a Belarusian village, was instead an ordinary girl until Nazi forces invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. As with many of her fellow countrymen, she ended up in a war she did not foresee. However, instead of being intimidated into submission, Anna decided to do something, to fight back. She worked as a spy for the Soviet partisan movement, where she was eventually captured by the Nazis, tortured, and killed. When the Nazi troops moved deeper into Belarus, the Soviet government fully understood that accurate and uninterrupted information flow was necessary for the fight. Due to the occupation of Germany, the formations started to appear in the forests and other areas which were not under the direct control of Germans, who began to fight against the Nazis and supplied important information to the Soviet commanders. Anna Morozova became an intimate link to this covert network and collected information on German plans and actions in Belarus. Her part was not on the battlefront that came directly against the enemy's forces. Still, she was a spy whose primary job was to gather information for the resistance while disguised as a member of the enemy army. The demands put on Anna were surveillance of German supply lines, troop movements, and military advantages. She worked deep into the German territory disguised as a local civilian, while trying to track the movements of the Nazis there. She collected important information about military activity that contributed to Soviet operations, forming partisan movements and Red Army strategy. Among the many she accomplished, her leading roles included sneaking into German-controlled zones and reporting on the Germans' future strategy. This information helped save numerous Soviet lives and did a great job, among other things, in breaking the enemy's plans. However, the increase in uncertainties of her job never seemed to dissuade Anna. She knew that any information on her would lead to her death, and all the Soviet partisans hated when their comrades were caught, as they would be dealt with brutality. Her intelligence contributed a lot towards the success of partisan forces, but her operation was hazardous. Even though she managed to gather valuable intelligence information and sneak through the country in 1944, Anna Morozova's fate finally turned upside down. Double-crossed by a colleague, she was arrested by the Gestapo while cooperating with the British Secret Service to obtain intelligence regarding the German forces in Belarus. The Germans did not take time to discover the worth of their prisoner and began torturing her in the worst way possible. Even through the torture that included burning her bare feet on hot iron and raping her, she did not surrender any information about her comrades or the partisan groups that she was working for. Anna Morozova, like any other woman in Belarus, went about her life. All this was to change during the Second World War, when she was put into a rather unenviable position of fighting manifested Nazis. Growing up in the early 1920s in a Belarusian village, Anna had a calm life until the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. As it was seen in many women in the country, she became engaged in a war she did not opt for. But instead of being afraid and a prisoner, Anna turns the tables. She rose to be an essential spy among the Soviet partisans, where she was eventually captured by the Nazis, tortured and killed. Vera Voloshina, the fearless saboteur who made a heroic last stand for freedom. Although many women who fought for the Soviet Union during World War II are still remembered, Vera Voloshina is not among the most popular. Yet she deserved to be remembered as one of the most courageous and dedicated members of the Soviet resistance. Vera was born in a village in the Soviet Union in 1920 newspaper, and her life changed dramatically with the invasion of the Nazis in 1941, as was the case with many young women of her era. However, instead of surrendering to the terrors of occupation, Vera chose to resist in the only way that was perhaps possible at the time, by becoming a saboteur in the Soviet partisan movement. When the Nazis began to overrun European Russia, they encountered strong resistance from partisans in the forest and country districts. These resistance fighters engaged in a ferocious warfare of hit-and-run operations and espionage against the intruders. Vera Voloshina also became a member of these groups and was famous for her stunts on the enemy territories. As a saboteur, she had the function of performing actions that would affect the German war in the occupied territories. Her insight into the explosives business and familiarity with the German military endowment made her one of the most prominent and shocking partisans. Some of the missions were to stop moving trains, lay bombs on German supply depots, and bring down bridges that were so vital for German military transport and supplies. She worked on a vast organizational plan designed to undermine the enemy's capability to make war, and developed excellent skills in employing traditional deception in her environment. Vera was well reputed for her ability to sneak behind German lines and be precise, hence refraining from a direct confrontation. She had no fear and would not even bat an eyelash before jeopardizing her own life for the benefit of her country, and indeed, the world at large by emancipating her nation from the clutches of the Nazi regime. However, no act of sabotage has been left without notice in such a dangerous environment. With time, Vera enjoyed several months of successful operations before bad luck finally caught up. She was arrested by the Gestapo on a mission in 1941, which was the beginning of her last days. Like any other woman that the Nazis believed to be engaged in the partisan resistance, Vera was severely tortured as a way of getting information about her comrades and the groups she was involved with. However necessary as it may have been, the brutal physical and psychological treatment that partisans were subjected to often brought out the best in them. Vera, like many others who never surrendered to their captors, turned coat on their colleagues. Vera Voloshina died the same way as Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya. On January 29, 1942, she was killed publicly by the Nazis. Thus, the Nazis intended to make use of these executions as a part of propaganda to deter the spirit of resistance from the local population. 2 young women were to be hanged in public. As a final indignity, they were paraded in front of an audience and ordered to dance, before one of the children was killed as a means of terrorizing other partisans. In fact, Vera's last moments were as brave as could be under such circumstances. The people testified that she did not have any trace of fear or remorse when standing in front of the firing squad. She never wilted, and she was determined even to the last moments of her life. Vera's execution, as ugly as it was a last throw of the dice by the Nazis, served to fuel the fire of partisans. Her death, like Zoya's, became the symbol of the Soviet people's struggle for freedom. The incident was instrumental in mobilizing the partisans all over the Soviet Union. Valentina Grizodubova, the skyborn heroine who soared through danger and defied limits. Valentina Grizodubova's name remains in the history of the Soviet Union as an aviator and the heroine of the liberating movement. She was born in 1911 in the Soviet Union, and her dream of flying came at the right time in the 1930s when female pilots were rare. She went against all culturally imposed norms and became one of the best pilots in the Soviet Air Force. Her memory is honored best of all for her heroism during the Second World War. During this time, she supported the partisan movement. Also, she aimed all her endeavors toward the aviation support of Soviet partisan units against the Nazis. When the war started, the Soviet Union was experiencing numerous problems with the organization of the partisan movement behind the enemy's lines. The Nazis took large pieces of the Soviet Union, and the partisans, entirely opposing the invader, were often poorly equipped and alone. That is why Valentina Grizodubova's aviation experience was an excellent asset during this period. Although best known for flying planes, she did more than merely transport men and materials for the partisan groups. When the war began, Valentina thought that aviation might be helpful to irregular fighters who fought in territories occupied by the enemy. She knew the imperative of using coded information delivery, supplying crucial equipment and food to partisans, and staging from the skies to blow up fuel depots, shadows, and the public spirit of the enemy. Grizodubova administered herself to carrying covert operations, such as dropping supplies to partisan formations, often supplying ammunition, medical provisions, and food to those actively fighting along the front lines. With her ability to fly in the most dangerous territories of the Nazis, she was one of the most valuable members of the Soviet forces. Like a plover, sailing low and making great speed over the hostile country, Grizodubova lived daily in danger, aware that she might not return on every mission. She also collected information, informed the Soviets, and assured the resistance groups regarding the location and posts of the enemy troops. The facts she provided were of tremendous importance, helping partisans to cut off the supply routes and perform actions that destabilized Nazis and helped to win the war against the Soviet Union's attempt towards victory. Her missions were dangerous, and the German forces started to take note of the partisan air support, thus increasing their attempts to eliminate links to the partisans' helper chain. The nerve-wracking daredevil missions are well documented in the Yalta Summit of notable women who fought. In 1944, Valentina was captured by the Nazis during one such mission. She died after her plane, which supplied partisan forces, had been attacked by Germans. She was eventually detained and tortured vigorously. The Nazis also viewed her as a threat, of course, but her superb talent and eminent value to the Soviets made her a living embodiment of resistance and defiance to them. Their intention was to frustrate her into submission and get details of other members of the partisan group and the military operations. Moreover, she never said anything to the torturers despite the torture they subjected her comrades and her to, the humiliation and other mistreatments they heaped on her comrades and her. Unable to extract any information from her, they decided that she should be executed. Valentina Grizodubova died a martyr's death on January 17, 1944. She was killed by the Gestapo. Her life was taken when she was only 32, after so much that she had done for her country and for her people. Despite this, Valentina was again calm, cool, and collected, with no change until the end. She walked to the death of a traitor as she did in the skies, and she had faith that the succeeding generations would fight for their cause. Despite the unhappy fate of Valentina Grizodubova's life, her life is continued in memorial form to remind the courage, determination, and selflessness of Soviet women during World War II. These and other actions of the partisan fighter and the Soviet aviator opened the possibility of the future liberation of her country. Thus, Grizodubova's name remains alive as not only the heroine of aviation, but as the real fighter of the Soviet country against the Nazi tyranny. The aftermath, honoring the fallen heroes who sacrificed for freedom and justice. The Somme dissertation, the Great Patriotic War of 1941 to 1945, was one of the most massive armed conflicts in the history of mankind, including millions of Soviet soldiers and civilians, women and men. The partisan women who fought behind enemy lines are equally one of the greatest unsung heroes to the victory. As many of you may know, these women were brave and patriotic and went to the war front to defend their homes and families. Despite this, their valor was not well acknowledged until after the war, which the Soviet Union made every endeavor to compensate. In the aftermath of the war, new memorials, military awards, and educational programs have been put in place so that the bravery of these women is not forgotten. One of the most significant attempts at commemorating these women was erecting statues and monuments that would symbolically represent the loss of the women. Across the former Soviet territories, various monuments to women partisans were installed, with special emphasis placed on regions where feminine resistance was most active. More often than not, the statues could be seen of women sporting rifles or ready-for-battle postures, reflecting them as fighters against the Nazis. For example, the monument dedicated to women participating in the partisan movement in the Bryansk region is a woman who became a victim of violence in the movement. These memorials served as a commemorative purpose of details that women underwent during the war experiences and as a record of their fight and strength. Not only were monuments built to honor female partisans, but many were also granted medals and titles that would attest to their heroic participation in the war. The elite was known as the heroes of the Soviet Union. It was tendered to some women who were cast as courageous individuals. This title was no light, and it was awarded in the understanding of the brave actions that these women undertook. Many of them were tortured or incarcerated or executed violently by the Nazis. For women like Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya, Yelena Kolesova, and Liza Chaikina, this acknowledgement became a permanent part of their actual stories, their names becoming Soviet saints. These medals, frequently coupled with a minor pension, were not simply a token reward indicating the government's appreciation, but were consequently reiterating the memory of those women who sacrificed themselves for their nation. Another vital attempt aimed at commemoration of the female sacrifice was made by the Soviet education system. After the war was over, the Soviet government made sure that these women and their actions were incorporated into school primers. Historical accounts and school books presented women solely as victims and never mentioned all the roles women played during the battle against the Nazis. Kosmodemyanskaya Chaikina and other brave ladies were introduced to the students of all the Soviet states and the generations to come so that they could know the extent of sacrifice. These lessons were meant to let young Soviet citizens, particularly girls, know they could be warriors and leaders back at the height of a national conflict. Despite the Soviet government's best efforts, many difficulties were associated with these women being recognized for their hard work. In light of the Cold War and the political scenario after the war, narratives of the women partisans were more beneficial in painting nationalist narratives and ideological consolidation. The stories of their heroism were part of a grand narrative, the official World War II narrative aimed at unifying the people of the USSR after the war, and they cemented the place of women in the society of the USSR. These women were promoted as heroes of the socialist states, and as prototypes of the firm, enduring, and loyal Soviet citizens the country wanted to present to the world. A lot of effort was made to respect the fallen principle. Points of celebrating women partisans were, however, not entirely fulfilled. There are cliché images of their procedures and burdens when, in sharp reality, their value addition was nothing near as glamorous. In fact, the bitter truth was too harsh to accept. However, the monuments, bonuses, restoration of rights, and schools that appeared after the Second World War to commemorate heroes made people remember many women who fought, suffered, and died within the partisan movement. Their stories continue to be a part of anybody's history of the Soviet Union, and evidence of how much people's sacrifices were brought to liberate their country during the worst of times.